Another night of protests are relatively peaceful, even as demonstrators defy curfews. Could last night have been a turning point? Plus, a big primary upset sends a hugely controversial member of Congress packing. Here's what you need to know. Good morning. This is Cheddar's Need2Know podcast for Wednesday, June 3rd. I am Jill Wagner with Carlo Versano. Hey, Carlo. Good morning.
Good morning, Jill. How you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. How's it going over there in Brooklyn?
It's sunny. It's crazy how this time of year, right? Because it gets light so early. I mean, it's 6:15 right now, and it looks like it could be like noon. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I've always worked early hours, so I love it when the sun's up. I feel like I'm not going to work at midnight.
I'm also going to work when it's still light out, which makes me feel like, a total loser, but whatever.
All right, Carlo, let's start with the news. The tense protests in cities across the country appeared to ease, even as demonstrators defied curfews imposed from Los Angeles to Philly to New York City. Thousands of peaceful protesters gathered near the White House, staying past the 7 p.m. curfew, as dozens of military vehicles arrived on the streets of D.C. New York City is under an 8 p.m. curfew through the weekend. In Minnesota, the tensions have significantly eased after George Floyd's brother called for calm. That state has also filed a civil rights charge against the Minneapolis Police Department.
First of all, I think it feels a little more, a little less, really bad this morning, right? It feels like maybe we have reached a turning point, like you said. But Jill, I watched the George Floyd video again yesterday. I had seen it originally when it was on social, and I watched in horror like everybody else. But I watched the entire incident. Just no distractions. I just really wanted to see it again. And it is so upsetting. It is so beyond the pale, even as far as these videos go, and they're always bad. But there was something about this one that just made me so sick. It was so infuriating, just on a human level. I think, that this cop would think that this was okay, and also that his fellow officers wouldn't intervene, which honestly to me is almost more upsetting. But when I was done watching that, I wanted to go march in the streets. No wonder people are out in the damn streets over this thing a week later. And it made me think, maybe we're giving the collective we in the media, maybe we're giving too much coverage to the stupid idiots who are looting and, ruining it for everybody else. But I don't know. I watched the pictures out of Washington Square Park yesterday afternoon. There was a really big march in Manhattan, and it was beautiful. Almost everybody seemed to be wearing a mask. The police were on the side; they weren't doing anything, and it was just like, I thought it was a really beautiful sight. And it seems to me like that's the story that should be told here.
Yeah, I mean, I was on the phone with a friend of ours, and he lives along First Avenue in York, and there were massive protests going up and down. I guess it was First Avenue or 72nd Street or wherever it was. And it is a sight to see, right? These peaceful protests are incredible. There was one where for 9 minutes in Colorado, to your point about that video, protesters laid down on their back and they just said, "I can't breathe." And they did that for 9 minutes. Because 9 minutes, I mean, that's the length of that video is in terms of how the arrest went. And that is a long time. 30 seconds is even a long time. 9 minutes, it's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things when you rewatch this video is it feels like it goes on forever, right?
Speaking of looting, there were fewer reports of looting in New York City last night. It looks like across the country, as the police presence in Manhattan shopping districts from Fifth Avenue to Soho was massive. And I mean, this is maybe a New York story, but just this spat between the governor and the mayor, really.
Oh my God!
I've never seen anything like that.
I know people. If you don't live in New York, this is probably like nobody cares. But our governor and mayor just absolutely hate each other, like with a passion. It's often funny, but sometimes it's almost depressing. But did Cuomo say, was that yesterday when he was like, yeah, I could replace the mayor if I wanted to. I'm not saying I will.
Basically, yeah.
um, but there's some photos this morning that I think really paint a picture of where we're at. Just in the newspapers today. Saks Fifth Avenue, right here in New York, covered in razor wire. I mean, I've never seen anything like that. There were National Guard members last night on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, looking like Cobra Commander from GI Joe, like head to toe military gear. This heavy military equipment on the streets of DC that you mentioned earlier, that the president apparently specifically asked for as sort of a show of force. By the way, they erected a perimeter. The White House. Obviously, there's a fence, right? But then there's Lafayette Park, which adjoins it. Which is one of the cool things about when you go to Washington is the White House is like right there.
Yeah.
It's not like it's when you go to other countries, like it's not you can't just like see the president's house usually. But they've erected this really big fence on the White House grounds that they've been working on for years now. But they've now created a bigger perimeter along Lafayette Park, which adjoins the White House. So I forget why I was trying to say that, but it was just it was an interesting juxtaposition. It made the White House, made the administration, I think, look much more isolated from the from the protests. Oh, by the way, Jill,
yeah, I mean, like, it's what are the images that are what images are going to be the ones in 5 years that are the images from this moment right now that we look at. It might be right. It's certainly going to be the pictures of the Lincoln Memorial surrounded by the military. That was incredible. And to your point, it might be the White House.
Right.
Yeah, it really did. I agree with you. It was shocking.
It was really shocking. By the way, Jill, I implied yesterday, I just wanted to get this in, that I didn't think that the Women's March accomplished anything. And one of our listeners on Twitter pointed out this argument that it led to the most women ever being elected into office the next year, which is a fair point. So I rescind my comment about the Women's March.
I'm laughing. I'm only laughing because as you said it, I mean, we can't go on forever with this podcast. We are under a little bit of a time constraint, but I thought to myself, I should have probably said to you, Carlo, and I was wondering if you were going to hear it. And I'm glad you did.
I forget who it was, but she's right. I'm wrong, and I admit it.
Okay, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is standing behind his decision to leave up inflammatory posts by President Trump. So he held a virtual all-hands meeting with staff yesterday. He called the decision tough but pretty thorough, and in line with his previous statements that he doesn't want Facebook to become the arbiter of truth. Audio from that all-hands meeting was leaked, which in and of itself, I think, Carlo, tells you that the staff not totally satisfied with this explanation.
Yeah, I mean, you saw a Facebook software engineer come out yesterday and publicly resign from his job, which is something, again, you do not see, especially now, given just the state of the economy. But he said that Facebook was, by leaving up the president's, quote, bigoted messages aimed at radicalizing the American public, that this guy, and I forget his name, said it was just a bridge too far for him. So I wonder if we'll see more of that. But the thing with Facebook, it's Mark Zuckerberg's baby, right? He can do whatever he wants, and he, this is clearly he is taking a stand on this issue. Whether you think it's it's right or not, I think there's arguments on both sides of it, right? But
right. So his argument was that it wasn't a call to action. He didn't feel like it was a call to action, and he didn't feel like it was a danger that was going to encourage people, that it was going to encourage violence. So given that, let it stand and let people judge for themselves. Facebook and Twitter have really become foils here. So Jack Dorsey, the Twitter CEO, and his team, they've taken the opposite approach here, right? I mean, and that's sort of what sparked this. And they slapped a warning on the same message on Twitter, saying that it could incite violence, and Facebook did nothing. So that's really what the issue is. But Zuckerberg came out, he had this interview with CNBC, really critical of Twitter. And I just want to mention one of our listeners flagged this for me on Twitter, of course, but Twitter itself investigated and took down an account that was claiming to belong to that National Antifa organization. That's the group that President Trump has said is behind a lot of the major looting and violence at protests. Well, Twitter found that at least one of the accounts is linked to a white nationalist group based in Europe.
Yeah.
And it just, I think, adds to this whole confusion over what is going on here, right? I mean, as we look at the vast majority of protesters who are really peaceful and just want change in this country, you can't help but be horrified at the images of looting and rioting, and it's just confusing as to who's behind it and what's going on. um,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think it even adds to that. And in these times of social media, you're now seeing a European group, a right wing European group, trying to encourage people to get out and be violent.
No, I mean, it's this, it's yeah, that like we've been talking about this since the election, the 2016 election, right? I mean, social media is just, it just everything, it makes everything so much more complicated. I know that there's good that comes from it. And I know that like the Black Lives Matter movement probably couldn't have organized without, Twitter and Facebook, but I don't even know. I don't know what to say. Yeah. It's wild.
Meanwhile, Joe Biden traveled outside of Delaware for the first time in months in order to deliver a speech at Philadelphia's City Hall. The presumptive Democratic nominee forcefully attacking President Trump for fanning the flames of hate and pledging that he wouldn't use the presidency to divide the country. Biden, who is now leading Trump in virtually all national polls, is also benefiting from a new influx of campaign donations since the protests started.
Yeah, the George Floyd's family lawyer also said that Joe Biden is likely to attend George Floyd's funeral. And I'm not positive when that is. I meant to actually look that up and I forgot. But anyway, assuming that happens, because
I think
presumably the
it's
president's
either
not going to
June
go.
8th. I think it's June 8th or 10th. And
Oh, so it's another week.
the reason I'm interjecting is because apparently, curfews are not common especially in New York City. For example, we haven't had a curfew in New York City since the 40s, when
Yeah,
another black man was shot actually by police. Um, and the thinking was that the protests were not going to let up, or are not going to let up until at least that point of the
right.
funeral. So apparently that was the thinking of the police and the mayor and whoever issued that curfew, is that this is going to be a long running thing.
Right. Well, I think I mean, if Biden goes, because obviously I don't think President Trump would, that's going to, that will make for some stark photos. I mean, Joe Biden is very good just from a, strategy perspective. Like he's very good in those sort of, moments of, you know, mourning or sadness. I mean, the guy has been through so much in his own life. Um, but I know we don't talk about polls a lot, and polls obviously, as we know, are meaningless in a lot of ways. But you mentioned it, Jill. We should mention it. Biden, he is now up 10 to 12 in the latest polling. There was a Reuters poll had him up, I think 10. Morning Consult poll this morning has him up 12. Also up in with men, which is leading Trump with white men, which is you have never seen before. Again, polls change. They're not very good at reflecting reality always. But one thing that I find notable in one of these polls, I think it was the Washington Post poll, is that Joe Biden is still at a very significant disadvantage to President Trump on the issue of who is a strong leader. And that's a very important marker if an election is held in a time of upheaval, right? That's the thing that helped George Bush win get reelected in 2004, this issue of who's stronger. That said, I mean, W was much more popular than Trump is at this point in 2004. So all of that is to say, who the heck knows? 5 months is a long time, right?
I think the question is probably whether Biden can win on people's just dislike of President Trump, or does he
Right.
need to get out there, pound the pavement, meet voters, deliver a real contrast? Biden is so gaffe prone,
Yeah.
that I almost think he's benefited from not being out there Because and people could say, he is not someone who's unfamiliar, right? We know him. He was vice
Yeah.
president. He was a senator for so many years. Um, so I think the question is if and when he does real campaigning, if that's even possible in a time of a pandemic, is something going to happen that people just say, "Oh my God, we can't, elect this
I, I
guy."
tend to I tend to agree with you, and I've never really understood when people are like, "Oh, Biden's not doing enough." Like, what do you want him to be doing? First of all, um, and second of all, like this, it seems like this election is going to be about turnout, and it's going to be about people's feelings about Donald Trump. Like that, to me, whether Joe Biden, is says something stupid in what is it, June, I just don't think that's going to be relevant to people.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see. While we are on the subject of politics, we have to mention that we're actually in the midst of all of this 9 primaries yesterday. The big news is in Iowa, where Congressman Steve King out of a job. King lost a primary to a Republican state senator. King, if you're wondering why you know that name, he is known for making racist statements, publicly promoting neo Nazis and far right figures. He served for nearly 2 decades, but he lost the support of the mainstream GOP in recent years.
Yeah, and no one is happier today than them, mainstream Republicans. This guy was probably going to lose his seat, or at least had a fairly good chance of losing his seat if he was on the ballot in November, and now he won't be. So the seat will probably remain in the Republican column. But I mean, good riddance. Like truly, this guy was just not a not a good man. I'm sorry, but
Also, Ella Jones, she is the first African American and first woman who is elected mayor of Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson, Missouri, of course, a couple years ago also had its own issues with police brutality against the African American community. So, a huge news there. They
yeah,
interviewed someone who said, "What does this mean?" And the city resident said, "Inclusion." So,
yeah,
cool
that's great.
there. All right, some COVID headlines we're following. Dr. Fauci said that he is cautiously optimistic about Moderna's vaccine candidate. He also warned there is a chance that any vaccine might not provide immunity for very long, given how the coronavirus works, which is kind of like the one that causes the common cold. Overseas, meanwhile, Iran, which was one of the first countries after China to get hit hard, is seeing signs of a second wave. And New York City, where officials are worried that protests are going to give way to a spike in new cases, testing is now free for anyone who wants one, regardless of whether they are showing symptoms. That is huge news.
It is, yeah. You can go to any of there's like 150 testing sites in New York now, and you can just get a test, which is great, Joe. We've been calling for that, nationwide for how long now? But at least here in New York, you can do that. Also, not to bring everything back to politics, but we are in this election season. The RNC, they're basically not going to do. They're having this big fight with North Carolina, the Democratic governor of North Carolina. And the RNC now says that they're not going to have the president accept the party's nomination there, even though the convention, of course, is scheduled to be in August in Charlotte. But the governor of North Carolina is saying he just can't guarantee they can have like a normal convention. So this thing is totally in flux. I don't know how you're going to be able to pull off either the DNC or the RNC this year, but definitely something worth watching. I mean, the Republicans especially are really going to want to put President Trump out there in sort of like a boisterous, forum to accept the nomination, right?
I don't understand why that's a controversial thing anyway. I mean, that's science, right? I mean, if we can't go to sports arenas and watch a basketball game or even
Right.
outdoor, it's a safety thing. I mean,
Yeah, it's
why
it's in
should
a basketball
thousands of
arena.
people be
Right.
packed in? By the way, maybe it'll be okay. All this guy is saying is, hey, maybe it won't. If we're seeing a
Right.
resurgence in cases and we're not there yet, I don't know.
Also,
But
I wouldn't want to go to one.
sorry,
Bless
Carla.
you.
Excuse me.
I wouldn't want to go to one of these anyway, but especially like, in the middle of a pandemic, I couldn't think of a place I'd want to be less. But
Okay, high school juniors can rejoice, or I guess panic if you were really good at taking tests. The College Board scrapping its plan to administer an at-home SAT exam, saying there's just no way to guarantee that every student has access to 3 hours of uninterrupted high-speed internet. The board, which administers the test, is asking that colleges be flexible in their early deadlines. The next SAT is scheduled for August. The rival ACT is still on for June 13th.
Jill, I think we've talked about this in the past, and I've said things like they should just get rid of the SATs altogether. But then I started thinking about this, and I failed to think that a lot of people are probably really good at test taking, right? And they count on their SAT scores to be the thing that gives them an edge. The same way, like a mediocre student might count on being like the star quarterback to give him an edge in college acceptance. So I don't know. All I know is that I hated the SATs. I was not a good test taker.
No, I actually am one of these maybe nerds or whatever. I'm a very good test taker. I've always been a good test taker, and I always sort of just studied, and I did well on my SATs. And look, I know there's problems with the test, but it is sort of this one universal thing that's given to all students that, despite where you went to high school or whatever it is another criteria that colleges look at. But now it's such a different test, right? There's writing. It's a totally different thing.
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought much about the SATs in like 20 years. Do you remember your SAT score? I'm not going to make you tell me.
I do remember it, and I remember I just took it once, and I was very happy. But I also, this just to me is like for these kids right now who are in high school and college. This is what is going on in terms of just the disruption to life. I'm just curious to follow, what happens years from now and kind of see what impact this had, long term. And we're just living in such unprecedented times. And I'd speak to so many parents who are trying to figure out, is there going to be school in the fall? And you were talking about potentially such a massive disruption for these kids in terms of their lives and education. Like the SATs is the least of it. And
Jill,
it's just incredible.
I'm glad you said that because SATs are obviously what you take them in when you're a junior, but I just don't want to forget about like the high school seniors right now. I mean, this is, at least in the Northeast, like this is when you have like prom would probably be this weekend or next weekend, right? You'd be graduating in a couple of weeks. Like this is this is like one of those incredible times of your life. You're right. We shouldn't forget about these kids because I really feel bad for them.
And just kids in general who, love school, hate school. It's funny. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a parent. She's like, my daughter does not love school and is begging to go back to school. You've never seen a situation. Maybe it's going to be a good thing. Maybe kids are going to realize that, hey, that school's not so bad after all.
Right.
Carl, what kind of good news do you have? Let's end it here.
So I really like this story about this guy, Rahul Dubey. I hope we didn't mess up his name, but he's a man in Washington D.C. And the other night, so the night before last night, he looked out his window and on his street in D.C. the police were really rounding up and starting to pepper spray a big group of protesters who, from all the reports, were peaceful protesters. And he opened his door and he sheltered something like 70 of these protesters, mostly young kids, in his house overnight. As they, to keep them safe. And I think that's the kind of move that really, that makes a real difference. And it doesn't use violence to do it. And it's just a real show of solidarity, I think. And my hat's off to Mr. Dubey.
Cool. My good news, CNN and Sesame Street, they've been putting out these town halls focused, on kids. They've been doing it about coronavirus. Now they're going to do one about racism. It's a 60-minute special. It's called Coming Together, Standing Up to Racism. It's a town hall for kids and families. It's going to air Saturday, June 6th at 10 a.m. And it's basically going to talk to kids about racism, the protests that we've been seeing, how to embrace diversity, and just being more empathetic and understanding in general.
That's cool.
We need
God
more
bless
of that.
Sesame Street. Yeah.
Also, a big thank you to everyone who wrote in yesterday. We loved hearing from you, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with us. We just really appreciate all the feedback, super valued. So thank you for writing in and keep them coming.
Absolutely.
All right, that's what you need to know for Wednesday, June 3rd.
Thanks, guys.